The next thing I try is a reboot the computer. Okay, so how is the audio now? The good news is it's not bad in GarageBand, which means this was a YouTube thing, and I'm wondering I used the webcam, but just need y'all to join in. I guess I may need to share. Oh, we got somebody on. Um, Whoever's on, can you just throw up the updated link in Facebook and MeWe, please? Assuming the sound is not bad. How we doing? So I'm hoping this has solved the underwater issue. I think probably part of the issue here is I'm using one computer to crunch two things, and my poor little computer might be a little sad. Much better. Okay, so it was literally just a YouTube glitch. I am going to jump back in. I had just told you about the Holler Neighbor live stream. See, this is what happens. You get interrupted. Sometimes what happens is like a delivery person comes and I go out and I'm like, what was I talking about? Well, my next thing is I get to remind you guys how you can email me. Woo! Okay, let's do this. Let's do this thing. Remember, guys, on YouTube, you can totally ask me questions or tell me my audio sucks and I'll make your life better. I really would appreciate it if somebody could put it on MeWe chat and on Facebook just for the people later and just let them know we had an audio problem. Finally, if you want to send feedback or stump the sauce questions, you can do it by going to www.livingfreeintennessee.com. Actually, it's just livingfreeintennessee.com. Click on contact, fill out the form there, or you can send me an email straight from your little old computer or your phone. It's Nicole, Nicole, at livingfreeintennessee.com. That's Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com. And guys, I do have to say, I technically took a week off, but I really got 2 actual days off. And in that time, the whole time, I pretty much didn't look at email. So if you sent me an email and I haven't answered it, Alan, it's because I kind of saw it come through and I need to go back and figure out where it is and reply to your email, which I do have a reply for you. Other people, if you're like, why hasn't she emailed me back? It's just because I'm not technically, so I'm back to working the podcast and coffee orders are shipping and that's it. So I am taking off through next weekend on some of my other stuff. And that means I haven't blocked time to go through all the email and do, that methodical reply. I do appreciate the emails and I do see them though. So don't let that stop you from emailing me because sometimes your email gets on the show. Speaking of which, our first segment today is Stump the Sauce. This is where we talk about any question you have for me. Sometimes I do get stumped. Like I had a question from somebody about how to do a worm tower the best way. Guys, I've never done a worm tower. If anybody listening to this knows like tips, tricks, ways to do a worm tower, you should totally go to Living Free in Tennessee. Click on the guest form, fill it out, and I will get you on the show and interview you about it to answer this person's question because I'd like to learn about that too. So every so often I do get stumped, Ken. Ken sent that question. He's probably already figured it out by now. But this one comes from Chris, and it's a Chris I've met. It was somebody who was at one of my workshops, and there's been more than one Chris over the years of workshops. So, that is what it is. And he says, recently, a friend gave me a large bucket of fresh figs. I made some jam, but still have a lot left. Do you have some ideas for fig recipes? Thanks. Well, Chris, first of all, cut those puppies in half and dehydrate them. If you have too many, you can dehydrate them and then bring them back into tasty dishes that you make all winter long. That said, cooking with figs is something that is just, it's lovely. Like you can use figs if you make a nice glaze for a steak. Like take a little bit of orange juice, like you cook the fat stuff, right? And then you add a little bit of orange juice and then some figs in there and some garlic and ginger, and then put that on a steak or a burger steak or something like that, or even chicken. And it's so good because what you've got going with the fig flavor is that natural sweet flavor with almost a vanilla overtone. And then you pair that with the citrus and it is over the top good. Now, of course, you could integrate it into baking like Fig Newtons. Well, okay. So my mom used to make these crescent cookies that I think she got the recipe in Germany when she lived in Germany. And you can put sort of like dried fruits in there. You could put fresh figs in there too, but like cut them up and put them in cookies and cakes, and that's really good. If you do a spice cake, add figs instead of raisins. You see how that works? But really, if you're overwhelmed with figs and don't want to have figs every single meal and not just eat them raw all day, which is what I'd be doing, um, I think dehydrating them as well is a great way to just build them into what you're doing the whole time. Okay, next up is what's up in the garden. Okay, I thought my garden was winding down, and then Mother Nature said, "Hey, let's send some rain to Tennessee." And my plant said, "We like water." So we've got this has never happened to me before. This is crazy. Okay, today it's August 12th, and I am harvesting summer squash. My squash plants have not died. It has not died. And usually what happens is I start my squash plants and then I get like 2 rounds of harvest off them, and then the squash bugs and the squash vine borers come and they decimate my plants, and I don't cry because I've stopped crying over it and I've stopped caring. Oh, I mean, I care, but yeah. So this year I didn't put squash in my aquaponics system. I didn't put squash where I had planted squash before on the property. I put it up right outside my office window on the hillside. And I put them out when they were about this tall. So I started them and then transplanted them. And I put them in about 2 weeks late from when I would usually put a squash plant in. And so far, I now am that person who has too much squash. Like, I now need to preserve the squash in the freezer because canned squash isn't good, or make pickled squash, which is good. Um, well, I mean, canned summer squash, canned wintered squash is fine. Anyway, I can't believe it happened. Well, it's good because my green beans kind of suck. So my green beans are, meh. I put a second round of them in, and then they never germinated. So then I reseeded that area and it never germinated. And I've pretty much decided that whole packet of seeds was foobar. So now I might actually try some more beans because I have more bush bean seeds. I'll put those in. My Franken squash, which I saved the seeds from an heirloom squash that Patrick from NPT Knives dropped off. And the squash, it was like a pumpkin. It was this long, it was huge. And it almost looked like a butternut squash. Well, the squash I'm getting looked like Cushaw. And that other one was like tan color. So I went out and knocked on one and it sounds like it's ripe. So I think what happened is the heirloom squash crossed with something else. And I've got a Cushaw like squash on there. So I'm going to have basically these pumpkin-y squashy things in storage. And I'm super excited because the vine itself has, it's gone 50 feet in several directions. It's huge. It has all these squash on it. It hasn't died. And, so that'll be some nice winter storage. And if it maintains the characteristics of a winter squash or a pumpkin, that means I can store it for quite a long time in my root cellar. I will be going out this week and starting to harvest some of them. I'll probably cut one open to make sure that I am right. That looks ripe because I could be wrong. It might not be ripe. Also, weeding and garden care are a big deal right now. We had a whole bunch of rain. My weeds went from maybe 5 inches tall to up to just above my waist in 7 days, because that's what weeding is like in Tennessee. So I've been just spending, 20 to 40 minutes in the morning before it gets too hot, carefully weeding or chop and dropping when I don't want to disturb the roots around the plants that the weeds are growing in. But I was pretty amazed this year at how fast that those have grown. But I'm taking my hillside back because it has been my goal to keep this hillside relatively under control by planting things that cover the ground from the light so we don't get a lot of weeds, which kind of worked. Like the sweet potato patch is working well, and that Franken squash is working pretty well. But then over by the roses and where the strawberries are, like that's where the weeds are above my waist in just 1 week. Tomato update: the tomato hedge in front of my house that was looking so good at the spring workshop and has given me lots and lots of tomatoes. We're up to 70 pounds off 12 plants right now. And the blight started coming. So the whole purpose of this was to keep the blight away. Well, the blight came, even though dirt hasn't touched it. The latest theory is that because the sump is low, maybe some of the dirt is splashing up into the sump. Don't know. What I do know is the blight started and we were experimenting pipe tomatoes or bucket tomatoes, which if you look at other YouTube videos about it, that will make sense. And the bucket based tomatoes are getting the blight much faster. The pipe tomatoes, a couple of them have started, but a couple of them don't have it at all. My blight resistant ones on the pipe side don't. My blight resistant ones on the bucket side do. So that's really informed what we're going to want to do next year. And what I want is 2 layers of pipes next year so that the back pipes can grow the first wave of tomatoes and I can trim the leaves up. And then I can, about June 15th or July 1st, have new plants starting in a row in front, because the one flaw with the pipe tomatoes is I can't start a second generation. And in that way, I can keep things trimmed as tall as my house is, keep the shade benefit from the tomatoes, but then also have tomatoes past, I think I'll have tomatoes definitely till September 1st, but I'm not sure how far past that we'll get because they're just really super tall. And then it's time to start doing my fall planting in the aquaponics system. This year, I'm going really light. I'm going to concentrate more on doing lettuces and things inside the house with my grow shelves, and let the aquaponics system kind of die out a bit so that I can augment the soil. So I'm going to end up digging those beds up. It's been 3 years. And what's happened is the soil level has fallen about 8 inches from what it was. And I want to add some vermiculite or perlite and also get some more, compost in there, more soil in there, just because it has dropped in volume so much. And by next spring, I'm going to want to be using that for the spring crops, right? That makes sense. Right now, though, we also have hot peppers in there that are doing great. With that, it's time for the main topic of the show: how to start a podcast. Now, the reason I'm doing this show is a lot of you have asked about it. I'm also live streaming it on YouTube, as I mentioned earlier today. That means I have questions from YouTube. Okay. And I'll build those in as we go. When I looked back to see, like, where else have I talked about building your podcast, I realized that episode 20, which was 8 lessons learned from starting a podcast, was the last time I did a podcast about how to start a podcast. And then we're at episode 334. This means those of you who are new subscribers or relatively new, or even in the last year and a half or 2 years new, your podcatcher will not load those really old episodes because I have limited how many go into the feed at once, just so that you don't blow up your phone when you download my podcast. Of course, they're all up on the website and they are in the member portal downloadable zip files. But episode 20 was a long, long time ago. And that was my first year. It's kind of fun. So I went back and looked at the notes because I thought, well, let's see what I said. And I've put a link to that episode if you want to hear it, because the perspective back then is going to be different than the perspective now. But those 8 things have not really changed. So I'm going to start with a listener question that I'm seeing on YouTube. This is from Survivalizer, who says, my question is, how do I know what to put in episode 0 or 1 of a new podcast? And the answer to that is just put something in episode 0 or 1 of a podcast. Many of you noticed that we started a new, like, Jack Spirko got us all excited about starting this new Unloose the Goose podcast thing. And he put out episode 0. He did a 15-minute overview of what the new podcast would be about. The reason we did that is because he was already promoting it and we wanted people to be able to hear something. And the reason we wanted to have an episode out before recording our quote unquote first episode is to get all your podcast feeds set up. You need to have an audio file. So he made one, and then we could wait for iTunes to decide if they were going to approve us or not, because the thing that takes the longest once you get everything technically set up for your podcast is you submit it to iTunes and they decide if it's going to be an iTunes podcast. Now, this is not a big old censorship thing. It's just they want to make sure the feed really works, so they don't have something in their system that, says there's a podcast and there's not. So you got to have the audio in there for that to work. And that means that you have to have an episode. Now, when you're starting a podcast, though, like first one, nobody really knows who you are. Just put out your first episode and use that to get all your feeds set up. There's no reason to have the I'm making an episode. I think from a marketing perspective, we needed to on Unloose the Goose, just in order to be able to get the feed set up for that first one. So we didn't say we recorded it and then 2 weeks later, finally we're on iTunes. Also, iTunes used to take 2 weeks. Now they take 24 to 48. So they're a lot faster. And I'm pausing the recording so I can have some coffee. You could see me how do I How do I drink my coffee while I'm recording the podcast? I hit pause and then I go here. So, hey, Jaggy, good to see you. Frog jam for figs. Buddy, what's frog jam? Are you going to like send me that recipe? Because I'll totally read it on the air. Yeah. Okay, we're going to jump back into it as soon as I figure out how to hit record. Okay, so with that, I am going to go through some steps to get your podcast going. Step number 1 comes out of a small company that's no longer so small. In Beaverton, Oregon is their headquarters. Just do it. Yeah, Nike. The biggest thing you need to do is start your podcast. And that means stop talking about it, start doing it. I actually had an interchange with somebody who's been wanting to start a podcast who did a really big favor for us and keeps talking about starting the podcast, and now he has to start his podcast because we linked to it. But it can be the hardest thing to just get started. And I think a lot of people talk themselves out of it just because there's always reasons why they can't. My voice doesn't sound right. I sound stupid. I say too much when I record. I don't know how to organize my thoughts. Like all of these little self-doubt things that you have. Get your mouth in front of a mic or the built-in mic on your computer or your phone mic. You can record on your cell phone. Doesn't matter. Get your mouth in front of it and record your first podcast and publish it. This is going to take you a lot of time. You're going to record it. You're going to export it in the wrong file format. And then you're going to discover you need a different file format. You're going to be like, crap, what do I do for audio hosting? Oh, I know. Okay, I'll try that. That didn't work. I'm going to try this other one. You're going to be like, how do I make this feed on this website that I need to have for my podcast to work? You're going to go, oh, wait, there's a subscription service. Maybe I'll try. But what about property rights and my owning of my podcast? You're going to go through that whole mess. It's going to take you forever. And at the end of it, what you're going to have is your first podcast produced. And that is the last time it will ever take you that long to produce your podcast. Because what happens is you'll make a bunch of decisions about how your audio files are hosted, if you have a website, or if you use one of the subscription services like Libsyn, right? Or if you do a hybrid version of those things, you're going to figure out how you want your episode numbering. You're going to figure out that you sound like you sound. It's kind of like pictures. You look like you look, right? You sound like you sound. And when we talk in our head, we sound differently. Like I sound totally different to me right now in my head than I do to you on my mic. But the truth of the matter is I sound more like what you're hearing right now than I sound like I sound in my head. And it's okay. And you don't sound goofy. Okay. It's very rare that you meet a person that actually sounds goofy. It just sounds goofy to you because you're used to how you sound in your head, right? So that's the first thing. And that is a decision. And if you decide to start a podcast, commit to 10 to 12 episodes. In fact, screw that. Commit to 20. You're going to do 20 on a schedule. And at the end of that 20, you're going to evaluate, do I want to do a podcast for realsies? Especially if you've never done one before. Okay. And that's because when you launch your podcast, all your friends listen to it. That's episode 1. I had 87 friends on episode 1. And then on episode 2, they're like, man, she's not that good and I'm not that interested. 14 of your friends listen. And then on episode 3, mom listens. Okay. That's kind of how starting a podcast usually goes. And that's okay. That's how it should go. You're getting your chops up, but you'll have some initial interest and then it wanes and then you build slowly back up and you build skills. So just do it. 2, use what you have on hand. You don't have to buy a special rig. If you have a podcast rig, use that. If you have a friend with a podcast rig, borrow theirs, right? Especially if they're not using it. And if you just have a cell phone, you can start with a cell phone. And this makes me think of a lady on Zello who she's blind and she was kind of struggling with keeping her blog going. And she said what was always in her way was that to take a picture of the thing she was working on. and she does a bunch of cool homesteady stuff. Well, okay, you can understand why that would be a barrier, right? If you can't see very well, because she can kind of see, but she really can't see. And so she realized, I can podcast. And so she started podcasting. And she didn't necessarily have a mic. So she figured out you can talk into your phone and record it and get the file on your computer and do all that. I don't think she's still podcasting. I think she's decided it's okay to post blogs, which she prefers the writing. I think last time I checked in, that was what was up. And that she doesn't have to post a picture, because if you follow her, you know that she doesn't see. And so why would you expect a big, beautiful picture of whatever she's cooking, you know? But anyway, use what you have on hand first. What I had on hand first was GarageBand on a Mac computer and my built-in mic. I actually owned this mic, or this mic's predecessor. The mic I owned that was like this, it was close to 20 years old and died about a year ago. And so this is the replacement for that, but it's the exact same mic. I had this really cool thing. Let me show you. I had this little teeny mic stand. I'm showing the YouTube people. I had this little teeny mic stand that sits on your desk. And the reason I had that was from doing presentations for the nonprofit I ran and having that on the podium, right? I had a mic cord, and eventually I didn't know how to make this talk to my computer. So I started by talking directly into my computer mic. And if you go back and listen to my first episode, you can totally tell. Did that make my podcast fail? No. And that's why I say use what you have on hand. Eventually, I got a Scarlett Solo box, which then goes USB to my computer. I could plug the mic in. I can control the levels a little bit. I already had the headset that I wear from recording rock and roll, and it worked. Now, if I were starting a podcast now and decided I needed a rig, I would get a specially designed for podcast recording mic setup. And I've done a couple of different, shows where I say this one or that one look fine. But I would I would do that as opposed to using studio equipment through this Scarlett Solo box per se, just because it's a little lower barrier to entry financially speaking. But if you already have the most expensive pieces and all you need is $100 thing, then you just get the $100 thing, right? So that's the second thing I would say. Third, define your core and stick to it. So I'm guessing that the reason that Survivalizer asked me about how do you know what to put in your first episode is you're thinking about starting a podcast, right? Well, what's your podcast about? What's it about? Originally, my podcast was just about homesteading and home crafts and how to do stuff, because people kept asking me how to do canning or how to do this or how to do that. And that was my purpose. And I added into it that it was part of my walk towards independence. So if you listen to my original tagline, it's a woman's perspective on the walk to independence. The reason I added that in is I was at the farmer's market with my friend Michelle. She was telling me a story about how she had built a feeder for her pigs, and she's shorter than her husband, and he's stronger than she is. And so she ended up, in order to get it done, she had to climb into the barrel to finish it and couldn't get back out. And so she was telling this hilarious story of trying to get it to fall over so she could get out. And I was cracking up, and I was like, when you're on a homestead doing stuff, sometimes it's something that would have traditionally been the male job, and you just do it because it needs to be done. You end up leveraging yourself a little bit differently. Like, women have a different center of balance than men, and that can really work in our favor, or that can really work against us sometimes. And so I thought it was hilarious, because my perspective is from the female point of view on what it takes to walk towards independence. And it's a little bit like I'm motivated by some different things than, my male counterparts. And I can say the world I exist in, the personalities are mostly male. And so what you're hearing about is lots of gun stuff and defense and that kind of thing. And then, totally over the top masculine food adventures. And that's great. But, there's another side to it. And, once you grow all the food, what do you do with it? You preserve it. And many times it's more the woman doing that than the men. Although most of the men I know, guys, who are in this world, very good at cooking very good at preserving. So it's not necessarily a gender thing, but there is a different perspective that happens there. So I was sharing that. Well, here's what happened. Here's what happened. My core changed. It's been like 5 years or something that I've been doing this podcast, maybe 6. I missed my anniversary every single year. I should like write it on my calendar. I also miss other people's birthdays, but just so you guys know, I miss my own birthday. It's a date. I'm not really into dates, I guess. And over time, it became more clear as I did more podcasts and took feedback from the audience. So define your core, stick to it. And then if you find it has changed along the way, adjust as needed. My core is still there, though. If I look back on what I originally started, what we have added is more entrepreneurship, right? And more of the self, like just the building, you're making yourself a better person by knowing that it's perspective and it's a choice. Well, it still was. It's still kind of homesteading plus that walk towards independence. And I'm glad I added that at the beginning. If you end up finding out you have to do a 180-degree turn 5 years from now, you may want to start a new podcast and you can make that decision. So far we're in 3 tips in. 1, just do it. 2, use what you have on hand, even if it's just your computer mic. 3, define your core and stick to it. And then 4, find a mentor. The cool thing about a podcast mentor is they don't have to ever know they were your mentor. Find somebody who you're like, this is a really engaging person. Listen to them and learn. And then every time you record an episode, wait 3 to 5 days, go back and listen to it and think, am I annoying myself anywhere? If you listen to some of my early podcasts, I liked to use the word so instead of so blah, 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 blah. So blah, 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 blah. And then I listened to some other podcasters and realized they have transition words, right? With that, blah, 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 blah. Next, blah, 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 blah. So I wrote myself a list of transition words that I could use instead of so. And so became my If I go back, I still to this day, I don't do every episode. I still go back and listen and say, okay, what annoying tick have I developed now? And I have friends who are like, oh, we'd tell you that if you had one. And I think, well, yeah, you would, but I'll probably notice more before you. In fact, the word like is one that somebody told me about. I was saying like too much and it makes me sound like a valley girl. And he thought you won't take me seriously. And I still use the word because the other part of that is not all podcaster hosts are the same. Some do super high production in the studio with little segments that are edited together with commercials, right? That takes a lot of time. Some are a little bit more off the cuff like I am. And if you hear my dogs barking in the background, I don't stress about it. You're getting a podcast from my real world, and my real world has dogs, and the dogs sometimes bark. So figure out where you are on that spectrum. And as you're learning from other podcasters, your mentors, that doesn't mean you have to be like them. Okay. 5. There are 4 areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 areas you need to really think about along the way. And this is a list you come back to every so often, right? Number 1 is how to prepare your podcast notes. Note preparation is a big deal. Some people like to write out their whole script and read it. Some people just want bullets. Some people just talk off the cuff. I do all of those things. And note preparation is a big deal. If I have something very specific I want to communicate, like when I talk about racial issues, I have a tendency to write it all out. I may not say the words when I'm recording it that are exactly what I wrote out, but I don't want to accidentally say the wrong word in a very touchy discussion. So I have a tendency to write that stuff out. However, I am much more genuine and much more interesting to listen to when I'm not reading. You can tell when I'm reading. I know you can tell when I'm reading. I try to make it more engaging, but hey, it is what it is, right? So note preparation is a big deal. Today, when I prepared my notes, I did everything and I was really careful. And there's one thing I didn't do. And this is something I usually would do, is I should have gone and talked to a few other people about fig recipes. And I got interrupted and forgot to take that step, which basically means Chris is probably getting an email from me with a bunch of recipes, right? Because I like to share recipes with you guys. So the key is to go through step by step. I have templates I use as an outline for each day. So a Monday show has this one, a Wednesday show has that one, and then there are 2 different outlines for a Friday show, whether it's a thought of the walk or an interview show. And that reminds me to tick all the buttons, right? It's like I have to say welcome. I have to say the date. I have to say what the episode is. I have to do an introductory paragraph. And then I usually have a couple of announcements. And then I have my usual segments. And then I have my content. And then I wrap up. Part of the wrap up is sort of the membership pluggy stuff. And then we end on Make It a Great Week. Having something to land on, like Make It a Great Week or whatever you want your ending phrase to be, is a way to ground yourself. If you have talked yourself into a corner, and a couple times I've been recording my podcast and I'm thinking to myself, you're boring yourself. If I'm boring myself, I'm really boring the people listening to me, and I'll just say, make it a great week, and I'm done, right? Having that thing that people expect every day as your closure is very, very helpful. I chose Make It a Great Week because it communicates that the power is within you to make your week good or bad, or your day good or bad. It's a choice, right? And I did that because that too conveys what the podcast is about. It's about responsibility and taking responsibility for your own happiness. So that's one thing. Equipment. Once you've done a podcast for a while, you're going to find that it's not okay to just talk into your phone anymore or talk into your computer. Equipment does not have to be expensive, though. You can go on Amazon, and the list of things that you can use changes a little bit every few months. And when I go on there, I read all the reviews of the different mics, but basically you need some sort of a studio mic, a way to hold it in one place so you're not doing I'm really close to the mic, I'm really far away from the mic, I'm really close to the mic, I'm really far away from the mic, right? You want to have that figured out. And then you need to have a way to edit. I use GarageBand. There are a lot of different things you can use. They all kind of do the same thing. Almost every computer has, a free way to do this. As you get better and better, you may want to go to something that's paid. I mean, you could do it in QuickTime on a Mac and then just export the audio if you really wanted to. It wouldn't be that hard. You just drop your segments in and go. GarageBand's way easier, but QuickTime came with your computer probably. As far as content, I think a show should be about a topic or 2 topics or 3. And people in YouTube are mentioning Audacity. Yes, I've heard Audacity is great. I've never used it. I would use it if I had a PC. Since I own GarageBand, I won't use it. I'll try to use it on a Mac. Anyway, your content, you want to keep your focus narrow per episode. And then here's the key. Listen to your audience. Today we were doing how to do a podcast. Why? Because I have an audience who's asked for it. And I want to honor that. And what you'll find as you get further and further into your podcast is people kind of like some of the things you're talking about. And then you end up with regular segments. That's how I got mine. They weren't, I didn't have regular segments at the beginning. I just kind of talked. And then people were really interested in the Prepper Pantry. So I added Tales from the Prepper Pantry. And then Operation Independence came up, and Stump the Sauce came up, and Tales from the Booze Whisperer, which has not been a segment for a while because I can't get the Booze Whisperer to describe wonderful things to me right now. Looking forward to that guy coming back or another Booze Whisperer coming in. But that all develops over time. And you can really gauge interest from your audience by doing your content and then listening to them. Production. Everybody worries about production. There are people who will over worry about production. You're talking about something that is going to be downloaded on a phone and listened through ear candy headphones, right? From a quality standpoint. Some people listen to it on a really nice stereo system, but most people don't. And so you have to be cognizant of the fact you're using data when you deliver your audio file. Therefore, you don't need to do 128-bit audio quality. You just don't need to do that. It's my opinion. Not all podcasters agree. We're not even on the radio here, right? We're coming over devices. And so I try to output an MP3 file that is not as quote unquote high quality so that I'm not killing somebody's data plan just to listen to one podcast from Nicole Sauce. Doesn't make sense at all. See, and now I feel like I need to pause the recording of the podcast just to answer all the comments. You guys are going good, but I hadn't figured out how to work it into the podcast. So give us a link of list we can get. I don't get affiliate money, Hat, because Amazon decided I was cheating. So, which I was not. So I can give you a list of links. I have some on my website. I think I did this one for the what mic to buy. Sometime in the last 3 months because people ask. And then, hey, Bowser Journal, I saw you on there. Hey, Tactical Redneck, get back to work, Tactical. I'm just kidding. Tactical has been finishing up a chicken tractor with Nighthawk today because we are raising meat chickens, and then a friend gave us some extra ones, and so now the tractor had to be done. So yeah, I used Garage. So the Bowser Journal used GarageBand on the old podcast, and it worked great. Yeah, it works great. Super easy. I actually, guys, so I run mine through. Actually, I'll talk about this on the podcast. I just have to listen to what I said so I don't sound like an idiot. So the other thing I like to do is compress the audio on the podcast when they're done. So sometimes when you hear the songs at the end, you'll be like, I can barely hear her singing in her own song. That's because I've compressed everything and the instruments got louder than me. I don't even worry about that. The reason I do that is you'll naturally move around a little bit when you're recording, and that causes loud times and soft times, even if you're not doing, the Sesame Street near, far, near, far, right? If you compress the file, then it basically makes your loud stuff quieter and your quiet stuff louder so that you have a more uniform volume. And everybody appreciates that, especially when they're driving in a car with background noise. I use Auphonic, Auphonic, which is an online tool to compress it. I know there's a way to do this in GarageBand. I haven't spent the time figuring it out. I'm sure YouTube University could teach me how to do that. And then I think Jack Spirko uses something called Levelizer. Does not work on Mac. And that's kind of a key there. So if you're doing Mac, you need to use a Mac tool, right? So anyway, what bitrate? I go the lowest bitrate I can, Jaggy. Somebody just asked me what bitrate do I use when I go. I think it's 64 is the lowest I can export in GarageBand, and I do that on purpose. But it might be 128. I don't remember. I set that setting up 333 episodes again, and I haven't changed it. So once I made that decision, it was made, and it's a preset on my audio mixing platform. And that's kind of a thing that you'll learn. Like that first podcast takes you forever to produce because you got to figure out how to publish it on the web. You got to figure out how to mix the audio file. You got to figure out how to compress the audio file. You got to figure out how to, output it. And all of those things have settings that you have to make decisions about. And then once that's done, that's kind of all presets in there. Another comment from YouTube is from the Bowser Journal. Adobe Audition allows you to level. I just don't like the monthly charge. Right. I'm with you on Adobe. I actually have a subscription to the Adobe Suite that they only allow you annually to stop your monthly subscription, which makes me hate Adobe even more. And the only reason I really use it is Photoshop. So I'm going to fire them. I need to remember to fire them in the next 4 days before I accidentally commit myself to another year. Yeah. If they did not have that year requirement, I'd be okay. And really all I use them for is changing, the size and the resolution of photos. And it means I won't be able to do as many fancy things, but I'm done. I'm over giving Adobe my money right now. Okay. Last thing. Areas to consider marketing. Your podcast will only get listened to if I know you have a podcast. So you have to tell people it exists. I started, just figure out which social media platforms you can be on that will spread it. Reach out to and get interviewed on other podcasters' shows. I know that sounds like a simple thing. To do that, you need to have thought through what you want to talk about, what your area of expertise is, how you can be a helpful informer and not just a salesman for your podcast on there. And then what you'll find is people will try your podcast and get going. The other thing is you can ask your people listening to share your podcast with their friends. It's a great way to start expanding. But do start thinking about, am I going to do some digital advertising? Like, what ways am I going to get my podcast heard? And then go for it. But I mean, the key to promoting your podcast is if nobody knows you exist, you don't, right? You're not just going to put them out there and people listen to it. And the same things, I mean, I find this with Facebook too. If you just start saying stuff on Facebook, you're just saying stuff, right? Unless you have a way to get people interested in what you're saying and draw them in and then share the information beyond you. And that's why we have memes and other things, right? You're not going to, you're just saying stuff on Facebook and your family sees it basically. And so it is important to think about how you're marketing it, where you're marketing it, and how you measure success. Okay. What do you think is more important? Content or how you deliver the content? It's how you deliver the content. So this is why you want to go back, listen to your podcasts, especially that first year, about a week after you've done them, so you're not just completely still in, your head's not in the podcast anymore. Listen with new ears and work on your delivery. You'll find after a year of podcasting, you're a way better presenter than you were before. That's what I found anyway. 7, network. Get to know other people. Network, not like schmarmy car salesman. Network like helpful resource person. Be social. If you're not social, your podcast is probably not going to get heard. And then the last one, and this is super important, block time and be consistent. If you are doing a weekly podcast, do the weekly podcast. If you're doing a daily podcast, do the daily podcast. If you're monthly, do the monthly podcast. Whatever your schedule is, set your schedule and stick to it. Because if you don't do that, then people learn to expect stuff and they get all mad at you. Like, I take vacations sometimes and I say when I'm going to stop. And I decided to extend my vacation this week. And my podcast is coming out today, even though I'm quote unquote on vacation today. And I have some coaching calls tomorrow that I'm going to do. But I realized that I need more of a break than I've taken. And I had finally gotten my world to where I could take some time off. So I'm doing it. But because I've promised something, I keep going. So block time and be consistent. And if you kind of get your process under control, you're good to go. Now, here's the part you guys have not heard about the podcast yet, right? And it's probably what people on YouTube and on this podcast are wondering. Yeah, Nicole, but how do I do it? Let me tell you how you do it. 1, write the show notes for your first episode. 2, come up with a title for what your podcast is called. Run it by some friends. Look and see if you can get the domain name just for the fun of it. You don't have to buy the domain name necessarily, but look to see if you can get it. 3, set up your RSS feed, which is what the different podcast players need to be able to syndicate your podcast. Here's how you do that. 1, you can go to a service like Libsyn or SoundCloud and set up your podcast there, and it will generate a feed for you. Okay. They are then hosting your audio. You pay them to, or if it's free, right? And that does all the work for you. If you're building a website, and my perspective is going to be 100% WordPress, you build the WordPress website, your blog post is your audio, right? And then you can use a plugin that will generate the right kind of RSS feed for you. Right now, I have tried 2 plugins recently. One is called Seriously Simple Podcasting. The other one is Blueberry, which is BLUEBRRY. And between the 2, I like Seriously Simply Podcasting better, but they have a tech issue they're dealing with, which has an interaction with really simple SEO that causes loops that are not good. So I'm using Blueberry. And Blueberry I don't like as well. And the reason I don't like them as well is they basically, they have to make money, right? They charge you for the statistics that I can get off the shelf for free with Seriously Simple Podcasting. Seriously Simple Podcasting allows you to put your file on a different host from your website, which you want to do unless you're going to buy a huge dedicated server, right? And That's good. So you can put it on Amazon or wherever, or you can put it directly on your web server. Don't do that. Don't do that, especially if you have a shared server. And that's great. The way they make money is they also offer through Castos uh, audio hosting. Okay. So once you get all that, and that's the hard part to figure out, guys. You hear me talking about it, and now you're probably confused. You build the website, you install a plugin that is Blueberry at this point, or Seriously Simple Podcasting, and I would pair that with Castos audio hosting. You host your website files on your web host. You host your audio files somewhere else. You generate an RSS feed, which is basically a link that every time there's an audio file, when you put it into a podcast reader, it knows that you have a new episode out. And it's like you type in, like, it has special extra fields. So you type in like the name of the podcast, the description, you put your 1400 by 1400 thumbnail image up, like all of that. Then you go to Apple iTunes and you create an account if you don't already have an account, and you add a podcast and you fill out all their information and you add that feed and you click submit and you wait. And you go to Stitcher and you do the same thing. If you do those two, you get on a whole bunch of different podcast readers, like Podcast Addict, all of it. And then what you'll find is people will be like, hey, man, why aren't you on Pandora? And then you go to Pandora and you figure out how to get on Pandora. Hey, man, how come you're not on Google Podcasts? Oh, I guess I got to go over to Google Pod. So that's what happens next. But if you just get on Stitcher and iTunes, that's like most of your battle. And then from there, you're done. You've done your first episode. You have a website, or you have paid somebody like Libsyn, and they have like a Libsyn/your podcast name page. And then you're done. You go out and you're on social and you say, this is where it is. And you start putting your episodes out and you start taking questions from people. Like, the mechanics of it is pretty darn easy. So anyway, I hope this episode is helping those of you who are talking about starting your podcast to get off your butts, take that jump, and start your dang podcast. If I can launch a podcast with a whole bunch of free market guys, where we all kind of have to get ourselves focused enough to do something in 3 weeks, called Unloose the Goose, y'all can do it with your brand new podcast idea, certainly within a month. So I'm hoping to see a bunch of new podcasts coming, and shoot me a link if you get it off the ground. I'll give it a listen. With that, if you want to support the show and the work we do here at Living Free in Tennessee, you can do it in 2 ways. One, get your coffee at hollowroast.com. I'm drinking my coffee today in this very special mug that I got from the Zoldak agency. That this is Zoldak Research. She has 3 different branches, anyway, from Sue. And we've partnered with them last year to do their Christmas coffee. And she sent out these awesome mugs. We're partnering with them again this year, I hope, to do another more exciting offering. That's all over at hollowroast.com, or you can become a member of Living Free in Tennessee. To do that, go to Living Free in Tennessee, click on membership, and sign up. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week. Okay, YouTube, the podcast is over. We have recorded it all. Did I get all your questions answered? Yes, Libsyn, Libsyn, generates an RSS feed and gives you a blog page post on their page, or blog page on their system. The thing is, they basically own your audio files. So if you're worried about maintaining ownership, a lot of people don't like that. I'm actually using them for my hosting right now because they generate a player and all that. But what I do, they have a section where you can say, if somebody clicks on the episode, where should I take them? I take them back to my website rather than the Libsyn blog, because I don't need the Libsyn blog. I have a website, right? It would be kind of sad if a web developer didn't have her own podcast website. So I have one for Unloose the Goose. I'm using Blueberry, and we're hosting the audio files on another server so that the website is separate from the audio files, but it's on somebody's dedicated server in the group. And we did that just because we had those resources. So it goes back to use what you have on hand. When you have a group of like 6 or 7 podcasters, you end up having a lot more on hand than when you're starting for the first time. So let's see. A podcast on the sea. Never thought about this. Podcast on. Okay. I think I got all of the questions on YouTube, guys. Thanks so much. I think I'm going to start having to have you use like hashtag questions in all caps so I can go back and see it just because those words are still really small, even on my big monitor here. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.